Speak, O Lord, as we come to you to receive the food of your holy word.
Hey everyone, want to welcome you to our program, our Bible reading program. If you want to go ahead and get out your Bibles, we're going to be in Habakuk chapter 1. We're going to be here in just a few moments. Really appreciate your time and your attention today. Hopefully you will open up your Bibles and follow along with us. We're going to go ahead and read Habakuk 1. Habakuk 1 is one of my favorites. It's very unique in all of the prophets, because it's not just like God's message to Israel, but it's more of a conversation between God and his prophet. You know, Habakkuk is really struggling. He's complaining to God, and God responds back. He has another question for God, and then God responds back to him. We'll get into that. You'll see that right here in chapter 1, right here at the very beginning, actually. So let's go ahead and read together. We'll be in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "The burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contentions arises. Therefore the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore, perverse judgment proceeds." Look at verse 5 with me. In verse 5, he says, "Look among the nations and watch." We're talking about God's response. You know, Habakkuk is struggling with what he's seeing and why God's not responding to him. And then verse 5, we have the response of God. He says, "Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded. For I will work a work in your days, which you would not believe, though it were told to you. For indeed, I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth, to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses also are swifter than leopards, and more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat." Look at verse 9. He says, "They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride their stronghold, for they heap up eastern mounds and seize it. And then his mind changes, and he transgresses, and he commits offenses, ascribing his power to his God." And so you have God's response to Habakkuk's concerns, his complaining. But then what you're going to see next is Habakkuk has a follow-up question. He has a question there in verse 12. He says, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. O Rock, you have marked them for correction." Verse 13, Verse 13, he says, "You are of pure eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Why do you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? And they take up all of them with a hook. They catch them in their net and gather them in their dragnet. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their dragnet, because by them their shear is sumptuous, and their food plentiful." Look at verse 17 with me. He says, "Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer then when I am corrected." And so God has this back and forth conversation with Habakkuk. And let's just kind of break it down. Let's look at what we just read at. Look at the very first verse. It says, "The burden which the prophet Habakuk saw." I think that's an interesting way for this to begin, because most of the prophets begin with giving us some kind of idea of who the prophet is or what's being or when this is. But we really don't know a lot about Habakkuk. We don't know a lot about his history, about who he is as a person or any of those kinds of things. And do we know when? Well, we don't really know when. There's some assumptions as to when this is, because we're talking about the rising up of Babylon. And so there's a couple of assumptions. Some of the sources suggest that it was after the death of King Josiah during the battle of Megiddo, in the early part of the reign of Jehoiakim, right around 609 and to 597 BC. This would have been a time where Babylon had already rose to power. And what's happening? They've already captured Israel, the northern kingdom, and what God's preparing them to do is come down and to capture the southern kingdom, which is what will happen. Or there are some sources who try to make the argument, or make a pretty good argument, for this being during the time of Manasseh, around 697 to 643, which was also a very horrible moral time of Israel's existence. And the idea is that Babylon has already rose to power, Babylon has not rose to power yet. Sorry, Babylon had not rose to power. In fact, I think there's a good point to this, is that God expects Habakkuk to be surprised, to be astounded by the fact that he's raising up Babylon. So that's a possibility here. But the truth is, we don't really know when this takes place. And here's what we do know. We know that Habakkuk is complaining to God. He's questioning him, and he's not really happy with God. And look what he says. This is the question that he asks. He says, "How long, O Lord?" Which is a very common question throughout the Psalms. Throughout Job asked the question. We have in Isaiah asking the question. We also have the martyrs in Revelation, where they ask that question in Revelation chapter 6. I think it's interesting that God allows righteous people to ask those kinds of questions to him. Multiple times, righteous men rise up, like David, who asked, "How long, O Lord?" I think it's okay for us to ask God questions. But how long what? Well, Habakkuk's question is, how long shall I cry out to you and you not answer my questions? He's prayed a prayer to God, and he's feeling like God's not really answering what he's asking him. So look at verse 2. He's kind of watching all this situation. He's watching all this unfold, and he wants to know when it's going to end. And in fact, he says, "I cry out to you violence." Habakkuk's sitting around and he's watching all these violent things happen to him. There's injustice, there's oppression. These are things that are not right. And so how should we feel when we're seeing things like that? Well, we should feel really sad, and we should be appalled, because it's not right. And that's really difficult for Habakkuk, to have to sit back and watch his nation crumble to the ground because of all the wickedness of the people. And he's really asking, what are you doing, Lord? Listen, Habakkuk is a righteous man. He's being tortured by watching all these horrible things happening around him. And look at everything that he's seeing in verses 3 to 4. He's watching iniquity and trouble and plundering and violence. Strife and contentions, they're on a rise. The law is powerless, he says. The wicked surround the righteous. They pervert justice. It seems like justice is prevailing. These are horrible things. Corrupt nation, wicked, wrong. Just a whole lot of wrong. I wonder how that feels. Do we know anything about those kinds of things happening? Ever see that in the world around us? We absolutely see it in the world around us. And so in verse 5, God tells Habakkuk, God responds back to Habakkuk's complaints, and he tells Habakkuk to watch the nations and watch the nations and be utterly astounded. Why? Because he is doing something in Habakkuk's day. He's working, and even when Habakkuk can't see that God's working, God is really working. I think we can understand that. We look at God and we're like, "God, why are you letting everything happen? Why is such wickedness happening here, Lord? Why are you just sitting back and doing nothing about it?" And I think God just works in ways that we don't always understand. We're not always able to see. we're so limited in our perspective of what's really going on spiritually and what God is trying to accomplish. In fact, God says, hey, look, if I would tell you what I'm doing, it's not like you would believe me. And so what is he doing? He's raising up the Chaldeans or the Babylonians to come and punish his people. You know, if you thought Judah was bad, just imagine how bad the Chaldeans are. They're wicked people. In fact, God says in verse 6, I thought I clicked on this one. In verse 6, he says, hey, look, they're bitter and they're hasty. You know, they're marching around everywhere, taking everything that they want that don't belong to them. And in verse 7, God says they're terrible and they're dreadful. You know, and he goes on to say that they're doing, their authority proceeds from themselves. They're doing what they think is right. They're going around doing whatever they want to do, and they're not playing by anybody else's rules. They're arrogant. They're prideful. You know, they're their own God. In verse 8, look what God says. He says, they're hoarse, they're swift like leopards. They're fierce like hungry wolves. They're like predators. He says their cavalry comes from afar. They're like eagles that are swooping down and catching their prey. They're like predatory birds. Look there in verse 9. Look what he says there in verse 9. He says they all come for violence. They face, their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. He says, hey, look, they are relentless. And they're known for their taking captives and taking them back home. You know, they do that all the time. They're determined. They're doing it with these. You think of some men in the Bible where were captives of the Babylonians. We're talking about Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were taken captives after Josiah's death in Megiddo, and they were taken back to Babylon, probably during the very captivity that we're talking about in this book. And they were forced to work in the king's service, remember? In verse 10, he says they scoff at kings and their princes are scoffed by them. So kings and princes, you know, they're nothing to them, right? They're nothing to them. Every king in every country is like a pawn to them. They move around on the board to do whatever they want to do. In verse 11, they do what they want when they want to do them. They defy their own power. That's Babylon. And here you have Habakkuk who's saying, God, why aren't you doing anything about this? And God says, well, I am doing something. And if I told you what it was, you wouldn't believe me, nor would you like it. And Habakkuk's like, well, this is worse than when I thought you were doing nothing. I'd rather you do nothing at all. And so what we're going to have in Habakkuk 1 verse 12, Habakkuk has a follow-up question. You know, he has a question. He has another question for God that kind of driven from what God just said. And his question is like, if you're a holy, pure God, then how can you use such wicked people to accomplish your purpose? Can God do that? Yeah, God does that all the time throughout scriptures. You know, there's so many examples of God using wicked nations. You could just think about Judas. Now, did God force Judas to betray Jesus? No, absolutely not. But did God use Judas and his greed that was already in him? Did he use him to accomplish his eternal purpose for Jesus? Absolutely he did. Now, that seems contradictory that God would do something like that, but it's just a part of his supreme rulership over the world that we just can't comprehend. God's never been dependent upon wicked people to accomplish anything, but he does use wicked people to accomplish his will. Look at verse 12 with me. What does he basically, he has a question for God, and what does he basically ask? Well, look at how he starts this. He's like, you're from everlasting. You're holy. He's just stating some things that he understands about God. You know, we may not understand what God is doing, but we can't forget that God is forever. He's eternal, and he is holy. And the great beginning of his question. And he goes on to say, we shall not die. And I think that's better translated, he shall not die, talking about God not dying. There's some debate about that, but I think that's a better translation. So in verse 12, you know, really, God had set up the Babylonians to come and judge and correct Judah. But they're way worse than Judah is. You thought Judah was bad. The Babylonians are way worse. And that seems really contradictory. First off, Habakkuk's like, why aren't you doing anything? But now when God's told him what he's going to do, he's like, wow, but God, I wish you wouldn't do anything at all. We may not like or understand the way that God works sometimes, but we just got to trust that God knows what he's doing. Look at verse 13 with me. He says, you are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? He says, hey, look, God, I know that you have pure eyes, and you cannot even look on wickedness. So why are you looking at these people and raising them up and using them, these people who are so treacherous? Why are you doing that? Why do you not say anything when they devour people? So in verses 14 and 15, he says, basically, they're like fish, or they're like fishermen who are looking at fish. What's a fish compared to a net or to a hook or to a pole? I think it says something about their cruelty. They don't feel any remorse for the fish. They catch people and they take what don't belong to them, and they don't care about it at all. They rejoice and they're glad, and all they're thinking about is what they get out of the whole thing. So look at verse 16. What are they doing? They're worshiping their own power. They're worshiping their own military might. They're rejoicing over their victories and their successes over these other nations. And their idol is their success. Their idol is their power, and it's their bellies, like Philippians 3 talks about. These are selfish, cruel, wicked human beings. Yet God is using them. In verse 17, he basically says, they're like the fisherman who goes and empties his net to go and capture more. And so we're just going to be fish to these people. We're going to be of any value to these people at all. And so in verse 2:1, the Babylonians, he's basically saying, God, how can you use them? So in 2:1, he says, I will stand and watch and set myself on this rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected. He's saying, I'm going to watch and see how God's going to respond. I don't know how he's going to respond. I assume that God's going to punish me or God's going to correct what I'm saying here, but I'm just going to wait for his response, and I don't know how I'm going to respond back. I think it's impressive that God allows us to be so open and to be so honest with God, to express ourselves and wonder how God is working, and because God knows we can't see those things. And we could go to God and say, what do you do? What are you going to do about this? But when God responds, we got to be ready to have faith and trust that God knows what's best and that God is working in some way, that God won't let the wicked, he's not going to let them win. God has a plan. God's going to work it out, even if it is that they're going to stand before God in the end and give an account for everything that they do. The wicked will not get away with what they're doing. Again, this is one of the most helpful passages, because there's been so many times in my life where I sat back and I thought, God, what are you doing? What's going on here? How are you working? What are you going to do about this? Why aren't you responding to my prayers? And then to realize that, like Habakkuk, God's like, I'm working. You just can't see it. I'm working in the background. There's like something that some scholars call the invisible will of God. He is working in the background. We got to trust and know that he is, and that God's going to work things out. And God's going to expect a lot of faith. And that's really, there's only 3 chapters to this. So we're going to study, we have 3 more weeks to cover this. So I encourage you, come back and watch this a little bit with us. We're going to see in chapter 2, the importance of faith. We're going to see in chapter 3, we're going to see the faith really of Habakkuk and how Habakkuk responds to what God's told him. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your attention today. God bless everybody. Hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless.